My name is Elena Ward, and I'm somewhere in that quiet middle stretch of life where people stop asking what you want and start assuming what you'll tolerate. I'm in my early 30s. I work in operations, one of those roles that lives behind the scenes, where you make other people's big moments run smoothly without ever becoming part of the picture. If you met me at a family gathering, you'd probably file me into the category of easy, not weak, just agreeable. The one who remembers birthdays, brings the extra serving spoon, notices when someone's drink is empty, and steps in before anything turns into a problem. I've always had a calm face, a measured voice. People mistake that for softness. They think silence means you don't have an opinion, or that if you do, you'll swallow it to keep the peace. And for a long time, I did. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I believed in the kind of harmony you build by being useful. I believed that if I loved people steadily enough, they would eventually see me the same way. That if I stayed reasonable, I'd be treated reasonably. This story is about the moment I learned that being underestimated isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's a convenience. Sometimes it's a role people assign you because it makes their lives easier and because they're confident you won't refuse. It begins with something that should have been simple. My brother's engagement party. A room full of family and friends. A night designed to celebrate love, new beginnings, and the way our families would soon be joined. Instead, it became a stage. A sentence was said, casual, sharp, and public. And suddenly, I was no longer a sister at a celebration. I was an accusation with a name attached to it. My brother accused me of ruining the engagement party, and he did it in a way that made it sound like the conclusion had already been agreed upon. Like everyone in the room had silently signed the same story. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out. I did what I've always done. I watched. I listened. I held my posture steady while my chest filled with something that wasn't anger exactly, more like clarity, settling into place. Because when you've been overlooked for years, you learn details. You remember timelines. You notice patterns. You keep receipts without calling them that. And you learn that the truth doesn't need volume to win. It needs structure. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no screaming match, no dramatic takedown, no moment where I become a different person overnight. It's a story about emotional justice, the kind that arrives quietly, with dignity intact. About how I let the truth surface in front of the very people who had been invited to witness a lie, and about what it feels like when the room finally realizes the wrong person was being blamed. Because lies don't last where truth stands firm. Before we begin, have you ever been in a room where people decided who you were without asking you first? To my family, I was the reliable one, not the exciting one, not the emotional one, just the one who would handle it. If someone needed help organizing a dinner, I'd be asked. If there was a conflict brewing, I'd be expected to smooth it over. When something went wrong, I was the person people looked at, not with blame, but with expectation. As if my role was to absorb chaos quietly and redistribute calm. No one ever said it out loud, but it was understood. I was useful. My brother Daniel used to joke that I was the backup plan for everything. If a reservation fell through, I'd fix it. If a schedule collapsed, I'd rebuild it. If emotions ran too high, I'd lower the temperature simply by being present. He said it with a smile, and everyone laughed. So I smiled too. I didn't realize then how often jokes are just truths wearing softer clothes. At family gatherings, I wasn't asked what I thought. I was asked what needed to be done. Can you check on the food? Can you talk to Aunt May? She's upset again. Can you just make sure this doesn't turn into a thing? I did those things well. I was efficient, calm, and unobtrusive. Over time, people stopped noticing me and started noticing the absence of problems. And when you become invisible in that way, people assume you don't mind. Daniel was always the opposite. Loud when he wanted to be, charismatic without trying, the kind of person who could say something thoughtless and still be forgiven before he finished the sentence. Growing up, he was the sun, and the rest of us learned to orbit. When he got engaged to Claire, the family energy shifted instantly. Claire was polished, warm in public, and very precise about how things should look. She cared deeply about presentation, how moments appeared from the outside. I respected that. It wasn't a flaw. It was just different from me. From the beginning, I was folded into the background of their plans. Not excluded, just assumed. Assumed I'd help. Assumed I'd adjust. Assumed I wouldn't object. I helped coordinate small details for the engagement party because that's what I do professionally and because Daniel asked me casually like it was already decided. I didn't mind at first. I told myself it was practical, efficient, easier for everyone. What I didn't notice, what I didn't want to notice, was how my role quietly stripped me of standing. I wasn't introduced as Daniel's sister anymore. I was introduced as the one who's helping with logistics. People spoke around me while asking me questions. Decisions were made in front of me without my input, even when they directly affected the work I was doing. And I accepted it, because pushing back felt unnecessary, because I believed my value would eventually be obvious. That's the dangerous thing about being dependable. People start believing you exist for the function you serve, not as a person with boundaries. By the time the engagement party arrived, everyone already knew who I was supposed to be that night. The helper, the fixer, the quiet one who wouldn't make things awkward. No one imagined I could be the problem, and certainly no one imagined I could be the one holding the truth. The first sign wasn't loud. It rarely is. It came a week before the engagement party, during a brief phone call with Claire. She was reviewing the seating layout I'd drafted, something she'd asked me to take a quick look at, even though it took 2 full evenings to do properly. She paused, then said lightly, "I think you may have misunderstood what I meant." Not asked, not suggested, misunderstood. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed between my shoulder and ear, staring at the same corner of the counter I always stare at when something feels off, but I haven't named it yet. I asked her to clarify. She explained, slowly, what she actually wanted, which turned out to be almost exactly what I'd already done, just described with different words. "Oh," she finished, "but it's okay. We'll just adjust it. We'll just adjust it." As if I hadn't been the one doing the work. I told myself it was nothing. Stress makes people imprecise. Planning events brings out control issues. I work with clients like this all the time. I let it go. But small cuts don't hurt because of their depth. They hurt because of their placement, right where you're already exposed. 2 days later, Danielle texted me a revised timeline. It contradicted the one we'd agreed on earlier. I replied, pointing out the conflict. His answer came back quickly. Yeah, Claire thought the original plan might be confusing. Let's go with this instead. Did you notice? Not what do you think? Just a quiet override. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. Not because I disagreed, but because no one had thought to tell me the plan had changed until after it already had. At the venue walkthrough, it happened again. The coordinator asked a question about flow, arrival times, transitions, and how the evening would move. I answered, based on the plan I'd been given. Claire smiled politely and corrected me in front of everyone. Actually, she said, we decided to do it differently. Decided. Past tense. The coordinator looked between us, slightly confused, then nodded and updated her notes. The conversation moved on. No one acknowledged the correction. No one asked why I hadn't been included in the decision. I felt something tighten just below my ribs. Not anger. Awareness. That was the moment I realized something subtle but important. I was being repositioned. Quietly, incrementally, from contributor to liability. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because it was easier to reshape the story than to admit confusion or miscommunication on their part. Still, I stayed quiet. That's the thing people don't understand about silence. They assume it means agreement. Sometimes it means restraint. The night before the party, I sent one last message confirming final details. No response. Not from Daniel, not from Claire. I went to bed telling myself they were busy, that everything would be fine. At the party, I arrived early, like always. I checked lighting, adjusted table placements, and made sure the catering staff had what they needed. People greeted me warmly, thanked me. No one sensed the shift yet. Then halfway through the evening, something small went wrong. Not a disaster, just a timing issue, music overlapping with a speech. It was the kind of thing no guest would remember the next day. But Claire's smile tightened. Daniel's eyes searched the room. And before I could say a word, before I could fix it the way I always had, my brother spoke, loud enough for people nearby to hear. Elena, did you change the order? It wasn't an accusation yet, just a question with weight behind it. I said no. Calmly, I explained the updated timeline he'd sent me. He frowned, confused. Claire stepped in. That's not what we agreed on. There it was, the first public fracture. No raised voices, no scene. Just enough doubt was planted to make me look uncertain in front of people who had never questioned me before. Someone laughed awkwardly. Someone else shrugged. The music resumed. The moment passed. But something inside me didn't, because that was the first time I understood. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about positioning someone to absorb blame when the image cracked. And I was standing exactly where they needed me to be. After that night, the tension didn't explode. It settled. That's how disrespect survives, by becoming ordinary. In the weeks that followed the engagement party, the story of what happened began to harden into something simpler than the truth. Not in dramatic conversations, not in confrontations, just in casual retellings. Small comments, offhand remarks, the kind that sounds harmless unless you're the one being slowly reshaped by them. Things got a little messy that night, someone would say. Planning can be chaotic, another would add, glancing in my direction without quite looking at me. No one said my name. They didn't have to. The implication hung there, weightless but persistent. Daniel never sat me down to talk about it. He didn't accuse me directly. That would have required certainty. Instead, he treated me with a new kind of politeness, careful, distant, like someone handling a fragile object they don't fully trust. Claire was even subtler. She thanked me less. She checked the details herself instead of looping me in. When she did include me, it was with instructions already finalized. Just a heads up, she'd say, as long as that's okay. We already decided, but I wanted to keep you in the loop. Kept in the loop, not part of the circle. I told myself it was temporary. Weddings amplify stress. People get territorial. I'd seen this dynamic dozens of times with clients. I knew how easily fear disguised itself as control. So I rationalized, I minimized, I adjusted. When comments stung, I smoothed them over internally. When I was excluded, I explained it away. When my input was ignored, I told myself it wasn't essential. That's how you teach people what you'll accept, by enduring it quietly. The family followed suit, not intentionally, not maliciously, just conveniently. They mirrored the cues they were given. If Claire corrected me, they assumed she was right. If Daniel looked uncertain, they assumed I'd misstepped. If I stayed calm, they assumed there was nothing to address. No one asked for my version because no one thought it was necessary. I became the background noise to a narrative already in progress. The most painful part wasn't the disrespect itself. It was how reasonable it all seemed on the surface. Nothing crossed a line clearly enough to challenge without looking dramatic. There was always plausible deniability. I didn't mean it that way. You're reading too much into it. We're all just under pressure. Those phrases are incredibly effective. They shrink your response before you ever voice it. And I let them, because part of me still believed that consistency would correct the misunderstanding. That if I remained steady long enough, the truth would reassert itself naturally. That people who knew me would eventually notice the discrepancy between who I was and who I was being portrayed as. What I didn't realize was that silence doesn't preserve truth. It gives lies room to settle. The final normalization came quietly during a family brunch. Wedding talk filled the table. Claire was outlining plans, timelines, and expectations. I listened, nodding occasionally. When she mentioned something that conflicted with a vendor agreement I knew about, I gently spoke up. Just one thing, I said, keeping my tone neutral. That might conflict with. Daniel cut me off. We've got it handled, just like that. No explanation, no check, no follow-up. The conversation moved on as if I hadn't spoken at all. I felt heat rise in my face, not from embarrassment, but from something colder. Recognition. This wasn't accidental anymore. This was a pattern. I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. Not because they were avoiding me, but because they didn't think there was anything to see. That was the moment I understood the cost of being agreeable for too long. When you normalize being overlooked, people stop believing you're entitled to space. I went home that day and sat alone for a long time. No music, no distractions, just me, replaying the past months with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. And for the first time, I didn't ask what I had done wrong. I asked a different question. What role have I been quietly playing that makes this behavior possible? The answer wasn't flattering, but it was honest. And honesty, I was beginning to learn, is where power actually starts. Once I asked that question, I couldn't unsee the answer. I had been assigned a role long before the engagement party, long before Claire, long before any single incident that could be pointed to as the problem. The party had only revealed it under brighter lighting. My role was simple. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed inconvenience so others could remain comfortable, the one who adjusted her expectations so no one else had to confront theirs, the one who made things work without asking for recognition, credit, or even consideration. It wasn't imposed on me in one moment. It evolved, slowly, almost kindly. Every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I stepped back instead of forward. Every time I chose ease over clarity. People learned who I would be for them. In Daniel's life, I was the safety net, the sister who would step in quietly when something went wrong and never bring it up again. He relied on that version of me, not consciously but completely. It allowed him to move through life assuming someone else would catch what he dropped. In Claire's life, I was the auxiliary system, useful but not essential. Someone who could be consulted when convenient and sidelined when not. I didn't threaten her authority or her image because I never asserted either. And in the family dynamic, I was the neutral party, the one who wouldn't make it a thing, the one who would understand, the one who would keep the peace even if it meant swallowing her own discomfort. That role came with unspoken rules. Don't disrupt. Don't contradict publicly. Don't demand space. And the most important one, don't surprise anyone. That's what made the accusation at the engagement party possible. Not the words themselves, but the expectation behind them. The belief that if blame needed somewhere to land, I would accept it without resistance. That I wouldn't push back hard enough to make anyone uncomfortable. I had trained them well. Realizing this didn't make me angry. It made me still. There's a moment when you see yourself clearly for the first time, not through self-criticism, but through pattern recognition. It's unsettling, but also grounding, because patterns can be changed. Roles can be declined, but not loudly, not suddenly. If I had protested then, if I had demanded fairness, insisted on explanations, called out the subtle exclusions, I would have looked exactly like the problem they were already half prepared to believe I was. Emotional, defensive, overreacting. So I didn't. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how often decisions were described as collective when they weren't. How frequently I was referenced when something went wrong, but not when something went right. How my calm was interpreted not as strength, but as consent. And I noticed something else too. They never asked me what I wanted. Not about the wedding, not about my involvement, not about how I felt after that night. It simply didn't occur to them that I might want something different than the role I'd always played. That's the risk of being reliable. You stop being perceived as someone with agency. Once I understood that, something shifted internally, not in a dramatic way. No resolve-filled speeches to myself, just a quiet recalibration. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to manage. I stopped offering solutions before being asked. I stopped explaining myself when no one was listening. Externally, nothing changed. I was still polite, still present, still calm. But internally, I stepped back from the role. And when you stop performing a function people depend on, even silently, the system starts to strain. I didn't confront them. I didn't announce a boundary. I simply removed my emotional labor from places where it was assumed rather than requested. That's when I realized something important. They didn't miss me. They missed what I did for them. And that told me everything I needed to know about how carefully I would need to proceed next. Because stepping out of a role doesn't cause conflict immediately. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes people careless. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen in front of anyone. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a place so unremarkable that I almost missed its significance. I was sitting at my desk at work, reviewing vendor contracts for an upcoming conference. It was routine, highlighting clauses, cross-checking dates, making sure what was promised verbally matched what existed in writing. This kind of work had trained my eye over the years. Patterns, discrepancies, omissions. I didn't think about it consciously anymore. I just noticed. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Hey, quick question. Do you remember what the venue originally said about sound limits? Claire thinks it might have been different than what we were told. I read the message twice, not because it was confusing, but because it was familiar. This was the same pattern. A problem is surfacing, uncertainty rising, and the quiet assumption that I would either clarify it or absorb responsibility for it, depending on what was needed. I opened my notebook, the one I'd carried for years without quite knowing why I never left it behind. Inside were dates, conversations, and names. Notes I'd taken instinctively without intention to use them against anyone. They were simply my way of keeping my own reality intact. I found the entry, the venue call, the date, the exact phrasing of what was said. The sound limit hadn't changed. The information hadn't been misunderstood. It had been selectively remembered. For a moment, I considered replying immediately, typing out the answer, saving the day, restoring calm. I didn't. Instead, I closed the notebook and stared at the screen. I felt something settle in me. Not anger, not hurt, but a firm, grounded awareness. If I answered now, the pattern would continue. If I corrected the record privately, the public narrative would remain untouched. If I smoothed this over, I would be reinforcing the role I'd already decided to step out of. That was the moment I understood the real choice in front of me. It wasn't about proving I was right. It was about deciding whether I would continue protecting a version of events that erased me. I typed a neutral response. I remember the call clearly. Let me check my notes and get back to you. And then I didn't rush. That pause, small, deliberate, changed everything internally. I realized I had leverage I'd never named as such. Not power over people, but power over information, over timing, over when and how clarity entered the room. And I understood something else. Truth doesn't demand urgency. Only damage does. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that I didn't owe immediate resolution to people who hadn't offered me immediate trust. That afternoon, I reviewed more than just that one note. I went back through weeks of entries, messages, emails, drafts, versions of plans that had quietly shifted without my inclusion. What I saw wasn't chaos. It was a consistent pattern of revision, decisions being made, altered, and then retroactively framed as shared understanding. And when confusion surfaced, it was directed toward me, not maliciously, efficiently. I felt no satisfaction in seeing it clearly, just calm. Because clarity strips away self-doubt. I replied to Daniel later that evening. I sent him the exact wording from the venue call. Date stamped, accurate, emotionless. He responded with a brief, "Oh, okay, thanks." No apology, no acknowledgement of the implication, just closure on his terms. And that was fine, because something fundamental had already shifted in mine. I stopped asking myself how to be perceived fairly. I started asking myself how to be positioned truthfully. That day didn't change how they treated me, not yet. It changed how I evaluated my own silence. It stopped being a habit. It became a choice. And once silence becomes intentional, it stops being passive. It becomes preparation. After that Tuesday, my silence took on a different quality. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was structured. I still attended family gatherings, still responded to messages, still showed up when expected. On the surface, nothing about me appeared changed. That was important. People relax when they believe the pattern is stable. But internally, I was no longer reacting. I was observing. When Claire spoke in group chats, I noticed which statements were framed as facts and which were actually preferences. When Daniel summarized decisions, I paid attention to what he omitted. When plans shifted, I noted who was informed before and who was informed after. I stopped volunteering corrections in real time, not because I didn't see them, but because correcting them immediately only preserved the illusion of shared understanding. It allowed others to continue revising history without consequence. Silence, when chosen carefully, creates space. And in that space, people reveal what they assume you won't challenge. They mistook my quiet for fatigue, for disengagement, for acceptance. Claire became more directive. She stopped softening her language around me. Instructions replaced collaboration. I nodded. I complied where necessary. I documented everything. Daniel leaned into reassurance without substance. Don't worry about it. It'll work itself out. You're overthinking. Those phrases only land when you still doubt your own perception. I didn't anymore. What surprised me most was how quickly the family adapted to the new version of me. When I stopped filling conversational gaps, someone else did. When I didn't mediate small tensions, they lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable. I watched carefully but without stepping in, not out of spite, out of restraint. There's a difference between withdrawing and conserving. I was doing the latter. At work, I was used to operating this way. You don't announce leverage. You position it. You don't expose all the information at once. You ensure accuracy, timing, and context. I applied that same discipline here. I saved messages. I logged dates. I cross-referenced versions, not obsessively, methodically, because if the truth ever needed to stand publicly, it would need a foundation that couldn't be dismissed as emotion or misunderstanding. And I was patient. That patience was misread. At one point, Claire said to me, almost kindly, You've been so low-key lately, it's actually a relief. I smiled, because in a way she was right. I was relieved. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't preemptively fixing problems that weren't mine. I wasn't trying to be seen. I was letting the structure reveal itself, and structures always reveal themselves under pressure. The closer the wedding plans came to finalization, the more frequent the inconsistencies became. Small things at first, dates that didn't align, instructions that contradicted vendor agreements, messages that assumed conversations had happened when they hadn't. Each time I noted it, each time I said nothing. Silence isn't weakness when you understand exactly why you're using it. It's a filter. It allows people to keep speaking until they expose the gaps in their own narrative. The engagement party accusation, once an isolated moment, began to look less like a misunderstanding and more like a preview, a test of how easily responsibility could be redirected. I didn't resent that realization. I respected it because it told me the truth would eventually be needed, and when it would have to be shared in a way that left no room for deflection, not privately, not emotionally, but clearly, publicly, calmly. For now, I remained quiet, not because I was afraid of being blamed again, but because I was preparing to ensure that, next time, blame would have nowhere false to land. What they never noticed was how much ground silence can cover when it's intentional. They saw less of me in conversations and assumed I was disengaging. They saw fewer messages from me and assumed I was stepping back emotionally. What they didn't see was the quiet architecture, forming underneath everything they took for granted. Because while I wasn't speaking, I was listening with precision. Every group chat became a timeline. Every voice note became a record of tone and intent. Every, as we discussed, turned into a question mark that I could later answer with certainty. This wasn't new behavior for me. It was simply redirected. At work, this level of documentation was standard. Contracts don't survive on memory. Neither does truth. I began organizing information the way I would for a high-risk project. Dates first, then decisions, then who initiated them, then who confirmed them. What emerged wasn't chaos or confusion, it was clarity. There were multiple versions of reality in circulation, and only one of them was consistent. Claire preferred verbal agreements. Daniel relied on summaries. Both trusted their own recollection more than the record. And because I had always filled in the gaps, neither of them had ever needed to reconcile discrepancies before. Until now, I didn't confront them when plans changed without notice. I simply stopped compensating. Vendors began asking follow-up questions. Family members noticed small delays. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to expose weak seams. And still, no one connected it to me. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People don't monitor what they don't perceive as a threat. I also noticed something else. When confusion arose, the first instinct was still to look toward me until they realized I wasn't stepping in automatically anymore. Then the discomfort set in. People started retracing steps aloud, revising statements mid-sentence, backpedaling without realizing it. Those moments mattered because every revision creates contrast, and contrast is where truth becomes visible. I compiled everything quietly, not in a dramatic file labeled evidence, just clean chronological notes, neutral language, No adjectives, no interpretations. Facts don't need decoration. The most important part of this preparation wasn't the information itself. It was a restraint. I never corrected a false statement unless it directly affected a contract or an external obligation. I let internal contradictions stand. I let assumptions linger. I allowed people to grow confident in a version of events that only existed because no one was challenging it. Confidence makes people careless. As the wedding date approached, conversations about the engagement party resurfaced, not directly, but as reference points. We can't have another situation like last time. Let's just be clear so things don't get mixed up again. Each time I noted who said it and how. No one ever asked me what had actually happened. That silence from them was just as telling as mine. There was a moment late one evening when I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook open and realized I could already end this quietly if I wanted to. I could send a few messages, clarify a few facts, reset the narrative in private. But that would only correct the information. It wouldn't correct behavior. And behavior was the real issue. They needed to see the pattern the way I had, without defensiveness, without accusation, without me being framed as emotional or reactive. That required context. And context requires witnesses. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing for a moment when the truth would surface naturally, because someone else would try to repeat the lie in a space where accuracy mattered. I knew that moment would come, because people who rely on revision eventually repeat themselves in the wrong room. All I had to do was be ready and stay quiet long enough for them to forget that I was. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no rush of adrenaline, no feeling of triumph, just a calm, unmistakable click, like a lock finally turning into place. It happened when I received an email that wasn't meant for me. A vendor I'd worked with before forwarded a message chain asking for clarification. The subject line referenced the engagement party, even though we were months past it. The vendor was confused because the instructions they'd been given conflicted with their original agreement and with what they remembered discussing with me. They were asking for confirmation. I opened the thread, and there it was, a timeline of revisions, names attached to decisions, language that reframed earlier agreements as misunderstandings, without acknowledging who had been present and who hadn't. Most importantly, there was a sentence that landed with absolute clarity. As Elena handled the logistics that evening, any issues would have come from her end. No hesitation, no ambiguity, just a clean transfer of responsibility. I stared at that line longer than the rest, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something I'd already suspected. The accusation at the engagement party hadn't been impulsive. It had been rehearsed, not in the sense of planning harm, but in the sense of laying groundwork. A narrative had been quietly reinforced over time, so that when questions arose, the answer would already feel familiar. That realization changed the weight of everything. This wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. It was about accountability being redirected intentionally to protect an image. I didn't respond to the vendor right away. I took a walk, let the information settle without rushing to act on it. That mattered. I didn't want to react from offense. I wanted to respond with accuracy. When I came back, I opened my notebook and cross-referenced the email with my own records. Dates matched. Language aligned. The pattern was undeniable. I finally had what I had been preparing for. Not leverage exactly, but proof that didn't depend on my interpretation. And I felt calm. Not vindicated, not angry, just clear. That clarity came with a responsibility. How I used this information would determine whether the truth corrected the system or simply created a new conflict. I replied to the vendor professionally, attaching the original agreement and confirming the accurate version of events. No commentary, no blame, just documentation. Then I archived the email thread. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. That was the most important part. Truth doesn't lose power when it's held quietly. It loses power when it's revealed prematurely, before the right conditions exist for it to be understood. I needed the truth to surface in a space where denial would be impossible, and I already knew where that space would be. The wedding planning meeting scheduled for the following week included family members, vendors, and the venue coordinator. A room full of people who had all heard some version of the engagement party story, but never the full one. It wasn't my meeting. I wasn't the focal point. I wasn't even central to the agenda, which made it perfect. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't organize a reveal. I simply ensured that I would be present and that my records would be accessible if needed. There's a difference between waiting and positioning. I was doing the latter. That night, as I closed my notebook, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, but respect for myself, for not rushing, for not exploding, for allowing the truth to become solid before asking it to stand. Because when truth stands on its own, it doesn't need a defender. It only needs space, and that space was coming. The days leading up to the meeting were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I didn't replay conversations in my head. I didn't imagine how people might react. I didn't rehearse outcomes. That surprised me. Earlier versions of myself would have tried to control the emotional variables, to soften edges in advance. But this time, I wasn't trying to manage feelings. I was deciding how much truth required my participation because I had options. I could stay silent entirely and let the vendor discrepancies resolve themselves slowly, with confusion diffused over time. I could address things privately with Daniel, show him the email, ask for clarification, and hope for accountability behind closed doors. Or I could allow the facts to surface in a shared space where the story that had been circulating could finally be compared against the record. Each option carried consequences. Silence would protect relationships, but preserve distortion. Private correction would preserve harmony, but rely on goodwill. Public clarity would risk discomfort, but restore accuracy. I wasn't choosing between peace and conflict. I was choosing between temporary comfort and long-term integrity. What made the decision clearer was how little anyone had checked on me since the engagement party. No one had asked how it felt to be blamed publicly. No one had wondered whether the narrative was fair. They had already moved on, confident the matter was settled. That told me something important. If I corrected this quietly, the system that allowed it would remain intact. The same dynamics would repeat later, with someone else or with me again. So I made the decision, not emotionally, but ethically. I would not initiate confrontation. I would not accuse. I would not expose anything that wasn't directly relevant. But if the false narrative appeared again in a room where accuracy mattered, I would correct it. With documentation, calm, and restraint. That wasn't revenge. That was responsibility. The morning of the meeting, I dressed simply. Neutral colors, no visual statements. I brought my notebook and my laptop, the same way I would to any professional briefing. I arrived early and took a seat near the end of the table. Not central, not hidden, observant. As people filtered in, the energy was familiar, polite, focused, efficient. The engagement party came up organically when the venue coordinator referenced previous issues they wanted to avoid. Daniel nodded. Claire added a comment about lessons learned. I listened. No one looked at me. No one needed to. Until the coordinator asked a clarifying question about responsibility during the event. Just so we're clear, she said, who was overseeing final execution that evening? There it was. A pause followed. Brief, almost unnoticeable. Claire answered first. Elena was handling logistics. Not with us. Not alongside the team. Just handling. I felt no rush. No spike in my pulse. I opened my notebook. I'd like to clarify that, I said evenly. My voice didn't cut through the room. It settled into it. I didn't look at Daniel or Claire. I addressed the coordinator. I supported logistics based on the timeline and instructions provided. I didn't have the authority to change the order of events or make independent decisions that night. Silence, not shock, processing. Then I continued, still calmly. I have the original timeline, the revised versions, and the vendor confirmations, if it's helpful. I didn't push the notebook forward. I didn't open my laptop. I let the offer sit. The coordinator nodded. Yes, that would be helpful. Only then did I share the documents. No commentary, no emphasis, just facts. The room shifted, not dramatically, but definitively. People leaned in. Eyes moved from paper to faces. The narrative, once smooth, hit friction. Daniel didn't speak. Claire adjusted in her seat. No one argued, because there was nothing to argue with. That was the point of no return, and I crossed it without raising my voice. After the meeting, nothing exploded. That was the part most people misunderstand about moments like this. They expect a visible fallout, raised voices, apologies, confrontation in the hallway. But the real consequences of truth don't announce themselves. They unfold quietly through recalibration. The meeting ended professionally. Action items were reassigned. Clarifications were noted. The coordinator thanked everyone for their transparency. No one addressed what had just happened directly. Daniel avoided my eyes as people packed up their things. Claire smiled too tightly at the venue staff. Family members made polite small talk, as if the air hadn't subtly changed density. I gathered my notebook and left without lingering. That restraint mattered, because the truth had been placed on the table. I didn't need to stand guard over it. In the days that followed, the shifts became visible in small, undeniable ways. Emails began including me again, but differently, more precise, more careful. Language shifted from assumption to confirmation. Can you verify? Please confirm before we finalize. Just to make sure we're aligned. No one acknowledged why the tone had changed. They didn't have to. Accuracy had re-entered the process, and with it, accountability. I didn't comment on the shift. I didn't reference the meeting. I continued responding professionally, neutrally, without any trace of satisfaction. That was important too, because when you allow people to save face, they're more likely to adjust behavior instead of doubling down. Claire stopped speaking for me. She began asking instead of directing, not warmly, but correctly. Daniel became quieter around me, less casual, more cautious. He didn't apologize, but he stopped making references to the engagement party altogether. That silence was telling. The family dynamic shifted next. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. When wedding discussions came up, People paused before speaking, not because they were afraid, but because they were recalibrating their understanding of who held what knowledge. I wasn't asked to fix things anymore. I was asked to confirm them. That's the difference between being useful and being respected. And I didn't announce that difference. I let it establish itself. Behind the scenes, I continued documenting, not because I expected another incident, but because accuracy had become my baseline. I no longer relied on goodwill to protect the truth. I relied on structure. The accusation from the engagement party was never repeated, not even indirectly, not even as a joke. It simply disappeared. Lies don't collapse loudly. They erode under pressure until there's nothing left to support them. What surprised me most was how little emotional fallout I felt. No rush of validation, no need to be seen as right. The clarity itself was enough. I had moved through the situation without compromising my values. No humiliation, no escalation, no rewriting of my own character. I didn't become louder. I didn't become colder. I became precise. And precision changes how people treat you. Some relationships cooled slightly. That was inevitable. When a dynamic has relied on your silence, your accuracy feels like distance, but others strengthened, quietly, subtly, in conversations where people listened instead of assuming. I didn't claim a new role. I simply stopped performing the old one, and that created consequences no one could argue with. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment, they arrived as an absence. The first thing people noticed wasn't what I did, it was what I no longer provided. I didn't anticipate needs before they were expressed. I didn't smooth over tension before it became visible. I didn't quietly absorb confusion and translate it into calm. And without that invisible labor, small gaps began to show. Emails went back and forth longer than usual. Decisions took an extra step. Clarifications were requested instead of assumed. None of this caused a disaster, but it slowed the system just enough for people to feel the difference. I could sense the adjustment happening in real time. At a family dinner, Claire asked a question about the rehearsal timeline. The room waited. No one jumped in. Finally, someone suggested, maybe Elena would know. I met their eyes and said simply, I haven't been involved in that part. It wasn't defensive. It was factual. The conversation shifted. People looked at one another, recalibrating. Someone else offered to follow up. I didn't rescue the moment, and the world didn't end. That was an important lesson, not just for them, but for me. Daniel struggled the most. Without my quiet buffering, he had to confront uncertainty directly. He double-checked details, asked more questions, paused before making statements he couldn't support. It wasn't comfortable for him, but it was necessary. Once, in a moment that felt almost accidental, he said, things used to feel easier when you were more involved. I nodded. They were easier. I didn't add anything else. Because ease for one person often means invisible effort for another. Claire reacted differently. She became more controlled, more deliberate. She tightened her process, compensated for the loss of my flexibility by asserting more structure. But structure without shared trust is brittle. Small frustrations surfaced. Misalignments had to be addressed directly instead of being quietly resolved. People began asking questions she hadn't expected. And for the first time, she couldn't redirect those questions toward me. That shift was subtle but powerful, not because it embarrassed her, because it required her to stand fully behind her decisions. The family, meanwhile, began to remember me differently, not as the one who fixed things, but as the one who knew things. They asked fewer favors. They asked clearer questions. Some even checked in with me privately in ways they hadn't before. Were you okay after all that? I didn't realize how much you were handling. I accepted those comments without elaboration. I wasn't looking for recognition. I was watching accountability take root. The most telling consequence was what didn't happen. No one accused me again, not ruining events, not of misunderstanding instructions, not being the source of confusion. Because the narrative that supported those assumptions had lost credibility, and once a lie loses credibility, people stop leaning on it, even if they never formally retract it. That's the quiet power of standing firm without demanding validation. I didn't correct the past in every conversation. I didn't revisit the engagement party. I didn't need to. The system had adjusted. People were more careful with their words, more precise with their attributions, less comfortable assigning blame casually. And that was the real consequence. Not discomfort, but awareness. By the time anyone realized something had truly changed, it was already ready, too late to undo it. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, missed expectations, unanswered assumptions, the quiet friction of a system that no longer bent around one person's silence. Daniel was the first to feel it fully. A week before the wedding, a minor issue surfaced with a vendor. Nothing catastrophic, just a detail that required coordination and clarity. In the past, he would have forwarded the message to me without thinking, confident I'd resolve it and spare him the stress. This time, he hesitated. I could see it in the way he phrased his message when it finally came. Do you have any insight on this? You can't handle it. You were in charge of this. Just insight, I replied honestly. I wasn't involved in that decision. You may want to check with Claire or the vendor directly. There was a long pause before his response. Okay, I'll figure it out. He did, slowly, with effort, and with visible frustration. That frustration wasn't directed at me, but it passed through me, like someone realizing too late that they'd taken a bridge for granted until they had to cross the river alone. Claire's realization came differently. She attempted once to casually reset the dynamic. We were alone in the kitchen after a family dinner. Dishes stacked, conversation light. She said, almost gently, I feel like things have been a little distant lately. Maybe we should all just move forward. It was an olive branch, but a specific kind, one that asked for closure without accountability. I met her eyes, kept my voice calm. I agree about moving forward, I said. I just think clarity is part of that. She nodded, but her expression tightened slightly. Clarity wasn't what she'd hoped for, because clarity doesn't allow selective memory. After that, she stopped trying to reset things emotionally. She focused on logistics, on control, on execution. But control couldn't restore what had already shifted. The family sensed it too. Not consciously, but in the way conversations adjusted, in the pauses before assumptions were made, in the way people now check facts before repeating stories. The engagement party accusation, once so casually accepted, had become something no one referenced anymore. Not because it had been forgiven, because it had been quietly discredited. That's the part people don't talk about. You don't always get an apology when the truth comes out. Sometimes you get silence, and silence, in this case, was acknowledgement. By the time Daniel finally tried to talk to me directly, really talk. It was weeks later. The wedding was days away. Emotions were high. Time was short. He said, I think things got misunderstood back then. I listened, didn't interrupt. He continued carefully. I didn't mean for you to feel blamed. I believed him, in his own way. But intention doesn't erase impact. I know, I said. I just needed things to be accurate. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing that for the first time. There was more he could have said, more I could have asked for. But the moment for correction had passed, not because I was unforgiving, but because I no longer needed repair to feel whole. Some dynamics can be adjusted early with conversation. Others, once exposed, can only be acknowledged, not reversed. The role I'd been assigned was gone. The version of me they'd relied on no longer existed. And trying to restore it now would have required me to step back into silence. I didn't. That's what made it too late to fix, not the timing, but the clarity. Once you see the truth clearly, you can't unsee it for someone else's comfort. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost quiet enough to miss. There was no raised voice, no dramatic setting, just a moment of stillness that allowed truth to exist without being pushed or defended. It happened the evening after the wedding. The day itself had gone smoothly. Beautiful, even. The kind of event people later describe as perfect, because the work behind it remained invisible. I attended as a guest, not as a coordinator. I smiled. I spoke when spoken to. I left early. Later that night, Daniel knocked on my door. He looked tired, not stressed, spent, the way people do when they've been holding themselves together long enough to finally feel the weight of it. He didn't sit at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets. I need to ask you something, he said. I nodded. Did you feel like I blamed you that night? At the engagement party? The question was careful, late, but sincere. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't soften it either. Yes, I said, I did. He exhaled slowly, as if he'd expected that but still needed to hear it out loud. I didn't think, he said. I was trying to protect things from unraveling. I know, I replied. But protecting the moment came at my expense. That was it. No accusations, no catalog of grievances, just a single accurate sentence. He nodded again, sat down this time. I should have asked, he said. I should have checked. Yes, I said again, calm, not cold. He looked up at me then, really looked. Not as the backup plan, not as the stabilizer, as his sister. I'm sorry, he said. And this time, it wasn't about restoring ease. It was about acknowledging the truth. I accepted it, not because it fixed everything, but because it was real. There was no follow-up argument, no need to revisit every detail. The point wasn't to relive the past. It was to mark it accurately. Claire didn't confront me directly, but later, she found a way to say something similar in her own language, a brief conversation, controlled, respectful. I didn't realize how much responsibility landed on you, she said. I nodded. That happens when things aren't clearly defined. She accepted that without defense, and that too was enough. Because confrontation doesn't need heat to be effective. It needs presence. It needs clarity. And it needs restraint. I didn't need them to feel bad. I needed them to see accurately. And they did. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But enough to change how they moved forward. That was the real resolution. Not an emotional release, but a recalibration of truth. Who I am now isn't someone new. It's someone unburdened, For a long time, I thought growth meant becoming louder, firmer, more visibly assertive. I thought it required confrontation or reinvention. But what I learned through all of this is quieter and far more durable. I didn't change my temperament. I changed my position. I no longer volunteer myself into roles that haven't been clearly defined. I no longer assume responsibility without authority. I no longer translate other people's uncertainty into my own labor. That doesn't make me colder. It makes me accurate. In my family, I'm still present, still supportive, but I'm no longer the invisible hinge holding everything together. When something needs to be done, it's discussed. When decisions are made, they're documented. When confusion arises, it's addressed where it belongs, not redirected. And that has changed the texture of our relationships. There's more pause now, more checking, fewer assumptions. Conversations take a little longer, but they're cleaner, truer. At work, the shift has been even more pronounced. I've always been competent, but now I'm also explicit. I state the scope. I clarify boundaries. I document expectations without apology. People don't push back because clarity doesn't invite argument. It invites alignment. Emotionally, I'm lighter, not because everything is perfect, but because I no longer carry responsibility that was never mine to begin with. I don't brace myself at gatherings. I don't anticipate conflict. I don't silently prepare to fix things before they break. If something goes wrong, it's addressed directly. If someone misunderstands me, I correct it calmly. If a role doesn't serve me, I decline it without explanation. That's the biggest difference. I don't explain myself preemptively anymore because I've learned that people who respect you don't require justification. And people who don't respect you will use explanations as leverage. I'm still quiet, but my quiet now has weight. It's not absence, it's presence without performance. And when I do speak, people listen, not because I demand attention, but because I've made accuracy my standard. I don't resent what happened. It showed me the cost of being endlessly accommodating and the strength of standing firm without aggression. It taught me that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as a recalibration of truth so clean that no one can deny it. I didn't win anything. I reclaimed myself. And that has been enough. There's a lesson in this story that took me a long time to understand, not because it was complex, but because it runs counter to what many of us are taught. We're told that keeping the peace is noble, that being easy makes relationships stronger, that silence is maturity. Sometimes it is, but sometimes silence isn't maturity. It's permission. Permission for others to decide who you are. Permission for responsibility to be reassigned without consent. Permission for your steadiness to be mistaken for acceptance. What happened at my brother's engagement party wasn't a single betrayal. It was the visible outcome of a pattern that had been allowed to exist quietly for years, and the truth didn't correct it through confrontation or drama. It corrected it through firm presence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't expose anyone to shame. I let the truth stand where lies had been comfortable. And that's what ended it. Because lies don't last where truth stands firm. Not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't owe people endless understanding at the cost of your own clarity. You don't have to become harsh to be respected. You don't have to explain yourself into exhaustion to be believed. You only have to stop participating in narratives that require you to disappear. Truth doesn't need you to perform it. It needs you to hold it, calmly, cleanly, and without apology, until it becomes undeniable. Some people will adjust. Some relationships will change. Some dynamics will never return to what they were. That's not a loss. That's alignment. And alignment, even when it's quiet, is a form of justice. If you've ever been underestimated, quietly blamed, or expected to carry more than your share because you handle things well, I'd like to hear from you. How did you reclaim your truth, silently or otherwise?